Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Slave Ships, New York and the End of the Middle Passage, by John Harris. Narrated by Paul Heitsch. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. The Mid-Century Moment. Oluwale Kosola recalled that the Dahomeans approached at night. At daybreak, they broke down the main gate and terrorized the town. Kosola was still in bed, but wakened with the commotion. He ran from gate to gate, trying to escape to the bush, but was grabbed by the raiders and tied by his wrists. He tried again to make a run for it, but was captured once more. He watched as the assailants, men and women, decimated the population, capturing some, decapitating others. Taking the severed heads with them, the Dahomeans marched 19-year-old Kosola and the other captives to the coast. When they stopped along the way to smoke the rotting heads, Kosola broke down. "All night I cry," he remembered, as an old man. At Ouida, a port on the Atlantic Ocean, Kosola and 109 other captives were sold to an American sea captain and forced aboard the ship Clotilda, bound for Mobile, Alabama. It was 1860, and the Clotilda was the last slave ship to arrive in the United States. The voyage of the Clotilda violated national laws and international treaties throughout the Atlantic world. Some of the first anti-slave trade laws had gone into effect early in the 1800s after tumultuous wars of independence in the Americas fostered more expansive definitions of liberty and equality and gave increased urgency to abolition movements. In many cases, the oppressed took up arms for freedom. In Saint-Domingue, in the Caribbean, slaves and free people of color secured independence from France, renamed their home Haiti, and banned the slave trade as well as slavery itself. In the wake of the American Revolution, the United States attempted to put the slave trade on the path to extinction, banning it completely in 1807, although slavery remained intact in many states. In the same year in London, Parliament outlawed Britain's slave trade, one of the largest at the time. By 1836, all nations that carried slaves across the Atlantic had banned the trade, and American rulers were beginning to sign anti-slave trade treaties with the British. In spite of these laws and treaties, the slave trade remained remarkably robust during much of the 19th century because the financial incentives and anti-black racism that supported it remained in place. In the United States, Cuba, and Brazil, large tracts of fertile land remained uncultivated, and planters sought more slaves to expand their agricultural operations. These slaves grew sugar, coffee, and cotton, which were in great demand in the United States and Europe, increasing slave prices in the Americas and creating healthy profits for traffickers willing to defy the law. And while elites in Europe, Africa, and the Americas made commitments to abolish the trade, many of them were deeply connected to slave interests or the slave economy and ignored or even abetted the trade for decades. Rulers such as King Galele of Dahomey, who was behind the attack on Kosola's town, presided over a region that had been involved in the traffic for centuries and where traders had few commercial alternatives. The results of the illegal trade were staggering. Almost 4 million captives left African shores between the beginning of the century and the closure of the traffic in the 1860s, around a third of all captives who ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean. The United States was deeply involved in the illegal slave trade. Despite the 1807 ban, American slave traders continued to smuggle several thousand Africans to U.S. shores. When this flow largely dried up in the 1820s, Americans became deeply involved in the much larger trades to Brazil and Cuba as ship owners and captains worked closely with traffickers in the major organization centers, Rio de Janeiro and Havana. around two-thirds of all captives arriving in Brazil and Cuba in the 1830s and 1840s came aboard American-built vessels, over 500,000 men, women, and children in total. The United States played a crucial role in the slave trade after 1850, when Brazil effectively sealed its shores to the traffic. Forced to rethink their operations, a small number of slave traders from around the Atlantic world descended on the United States, incorporating American ports directly into their operations for the first time in a generation. New York and New Orleans now became key nodes in a new slaving nexus that stretched from Huida and Cabinda in Africa to Havana and Matanzas in Cuba. This was the slave trade's final triangle. Some captives, such as Kosola, ended up in the American South, but the vast majority emerged from the holds of filthy U.S. slavers in Spanish Cuba, the only remaining major market for trafficked Africans. The United States-Africa-Cuban nexus was powerful. Although the trade would never return to pre-1850s levels, an estimated 474 illegal voyages and 198,266 men, women, and children passed around this and other minor circuits by the time it was firmly established in 1853 until the end of the trade in 1867. Tens of thousands perished aboard illegal slavers, their bodies dumped overboard and into the deep. No American city was more closely tied to this trade than New York. A peninsular metropolis lying between the Hudson and East Rivers, New York was America's colossus, with a population soaring to over 500,000 and doubling every 10 years. It was the largest city in the land. Trade was at the center of New York life. From Manhattan, dozens of wharves bearing small armies of dock workers jutted out in all directions, servicing sailing ships that carried goods from around the world. Migrants also funneled into New York from across the United States and the globe, adding to the hubbub. The American publishing industry was based there, including the New York Times and New York Herald, which vied for the attentions of an increasingly literate and information-hungry nation on a daily basis. New York was a city of extremes, home to the mega-rich and the abject poor, to the grand boulevard of Broadway and the sprawling slum of Five Points. Here, the serene mixed with the chaotic. As construction on Central Park was getting underway, pigs and dogs still ran wild in the streets. In Gotham, order and disorder fought for supremacy, and it was never entirely clear which had the upper hand. A rising writer from Long Island, Walt Whitman, described New York best. City of the world, mettlesome, mad, extravagant. Around a dozen illegal slave traders, collectively known as the Portuguese Company, entered this bustling scene in the early 1850s. Exiles from the collapsing slave trade to Brazil, they came determined to establish a new U.S. hub for the traffic to Cuba. The leading figure was Manuel Cunha Reis, who had left his native Portugal in his youth and became a slave trader in Rio de Janeiro and Portuguese Angola, Brazil's main slaving partner in Africa. His entire slaving career was conducted illegally. In Angola, Cunha Reis probably crossed paths with José da Silva Maia Ferreira, the man who would become his partner in New York. A proud Angolan of Portuguese heritage, Maia Ferreira worked temporarily for the joint British-Portuguese anti-slave trade court in Angola in the 1840s, learning the inner workings of the traffic, knowledge he would soon put to use as a slave trader in New York. Both Maia Ferreira and Cunha Reis were young men, mid-20s and early 30s, had strong African ties, and were determined not to let the collapse of the Brazilian trade end their dreams of wealth and status. By the early 1850s, the pair had set up an office in Manhattan's Merchant District and begun purchasing ships to send to Africa for slaves. Here they were assisted by a host of accomplices, including ship captains, crews, and corrupt officials who were rivaled by merchants with long-standing ties to Cuba who wanted a share of the slave trade for themselves. Soon, Baltimore, Boston, New Orleans, and other...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?